It happened quietly, almost too quietly for history to notice. In the stillness of Buckingham Palace, as London slept, a crown changed hands without the roar of trumpets or the echo of ceremony. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, make sure to subscribe, because the truths we uncover here go beyond headlines and press releases. This is the untold reality of what truly unfolded inside the palace walls, and how one silent decision would reshape the monarchy forever. It began not with a grand proclamation, but with a whisper. Sources close to the royal household describe the atmosphere as eerily calm, a setting more like a farewell than a celebration. Inside a private chamber, King Charles III made the decision that no one expected to come so soon, to relinquish the crown to his eldest son, William. There were no public festivities, no global broadcast, and no cheering crowds. Only a few trusted witnesses stood present as the royal line quietly shifted in the dead of night. For the first time in centuries, a monarch handed over the throne without the world even knowing it had happened. Observers described the moment as surreal, a collision of tradition and personal choice. King Charles, who had spent a lifetime preparing for his role, simply decided that the weight of the crown was no longer his to bear. Perhaps it was reflection, or age, or a sense of completion. Whatever the reason, it became clear that this was not an abdication born of crisis, but of quiet conviction. He had spent decades restoring stability, and now, as he looked to his son, he saw continuity. A passing of torch not for power, but for peace. Within the palace, the transition was almost ceremonial in its simplicity. Charles stood facing William, and in a single, wordless gesture, removed the crown. It was placed not upon a cushion, but directly into William's hands, a symbolic act that carried centuries of meaning. William's eyes, witnesses said, filled with emotion. He was not just inheriting a title, but the soul of the monarchy itself, the duty, the sacrifice, the silent endurance that defined every ruler before him. The choice to hold this transfer in private was deliberate. Charles, ever mindful of history's gaze, wanted this moment to belong to family, not spectacle. He refused the idea of televised rituals or public display. To him, the crown was not about performance, it was about purpose. This decision, though shocking to the world once it leaked, was rooted in something deeply personal, a belief that the next generation was ready, and that he had done his part. Behind closed doors, emotions ran deep. The atmosphere was not one of mourning, but of solemn reflection. The royal staff, those who had served Charles for decades, watched as history unfolded before them in silence. They saw not a man stepping down, but a father letting go. It was said that Charles spoke only once during the ceremony, his voice barely above a whisper. It's time. Those two words carried the weight of everything unspoken, the end of one reign and the beginning of another. What made this event so remarkable was not the act itself, but how it was handled. There were no leaks, no political manoeuvring, no public disputes, just quiet acceptance. For an institution often defined by pageantry and control, this kind of humility was unprecedented. It showed that the monarchy, despite its image of rigidity, was capable of grace and evolution. In the end, this wasn't just the passing of a title, it was the passing of trust. As dawn broke over London, the palace gates remained closed, and no official statement was made. Even the royal press office stayed silent for hours. It wasn't until late the next morning that whispers began to circulate. First among journalists, then across social media. Something monumental had happened, but no one could confirm exactly what. All that was clear was that the royal flag had changed, and with it, so had the course of history. When the news finally broke, it stunned the world. Commentators called it the quietest revolution the monarchy has ever seen. Yet within those stone walls, the atmosphere was one of calm transition. William, now king, did not take the moment as triumph. Instead, he approached it with reverence, a continuation of legacy, rather than a conquest of it. He was seen walking the palace corridors that night, alone, crown in hand, deep in thought. Those close to him said he appeared humbled, almost haunted by the responsibility he'd inherited. He understood that this moment wasn't just about leadership. It was about continuity, about ensuring the monarchy remained relevant in a changing world. In his first private words as sovereign, he vowed to lead with compassion and conscience. They weren't the words of a ruler seeking authority, but of a son promising to honour his father's trust. Meanwhile, Charles quietly retired from his role, adopting the new title Advisor Emeritus. It was a name chosen carefully, not former king, not abdicated monarch, but something that suggested continued guidance without control. In his private quarters, he was said to have found peace. After decades of public duty, he finally had the space to breathe, to reflect, to simply be. But not everyone was prepared for how quickly things would change. The public's reaction was instantaneous and intense. Some saw the move as graceful and forward-thinking, a father ensuring stability through renewal. Others saw it as abrupt, even unsettling. Questions arose. Why now? What prompted such secrecy? And what did it mean for the future of the crown? In truth, those closest to the matter believe it was planned for months, a carefully considered step meant to protect the monarchy from the turbulence of public scrutiny. Charles had always valued privacy, and in his final act as sovereign, he ensured that the transition would honour that principle. The crown was not to be paraded, but passed, quietly, respectfully, and without fanfare. As word spread, the world began to understand the significance. This was not merely the changing of rulers. It was a redefinition of what royalty could be. It showed that true power sometimes lies not in holding on, but in letting go. The monarchy, for all its centuries of rigidity, had chosen humanity over tradition, emotion over display. For the royal family, it was the dawn of a new chapter, one rooted in humility, grace, and the recognition that leadership is not eternal. The ceremony may have been silent, but its message resounded across the world. The crown is not about who wears it, but about how it is carried. And in that still moment, as the echoes of history faded into the night, the monarchy found something it had long been missing. Not just a new king, but a renewed sense of purpose.
When the world finally learned what had happened, the headlines came fast, but none could capture the quiet heartbreak that followed behind palace doors. The most shocking revelation wasn't that King Charles had stepped down, it was that Queen Camilla had been stripped of her title entirely. In a matter of hours, the woman once crowned beside him went from Her Majesty the Queen to a title few had ever heard before, Queen Consort Emerita. It was more than a change in name, it was a public demotion, a symbol that her reign had come to a complete and deliberate end. The palace confirmed it in a short, carefully worded statement. There were no interviews, no commentary, just a few lines acknowledging the reclassification of her role. But behind those sterile words lay a story of quiet understanding, emotional endurance, and a choice that revealed more about the royal family's inner world than any scandal ever could. Insiders say the decision was not a punishment, it was a farewell. Camilla had always known her time as queen would be tied to Charles'. Their partnership was built not just on marriage, but on shared duty. And as Charles prepared to hand over the crown, Camilla prepared to release her title with him. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was one made in mutual recognition of what the monarchy needed next: clarity, simplicity, and renewal. The conversation that sealed it all reportedly happened the night before the private coronation. Charles, quiet and contemplative, spoke to her with the same tone he had used when they faced their most difficult moments together: soft, measured, resolute. "It's time," he said, the same two words he would repeat the next day as he passed the crown to his son. Camilla didn't protest, didn't plead. She simply nodded, understanding what he meant without needing explanation. The reign they had shared was over, and the next chapter belonged to someone else. Observers have long described Camilla as one of the most misunderstood figures in royal history: resilient, patient, yet always shadowed by public opinion. Over the years, she had transformed herself from controversy into quiet dignity, earning the respect of many who once doubted her. So when she agreed to relinquish her title, it wasn't from weakness, but from wisdom. She knew that the monarchy was entering a new era, one that needed a clean beginning, free of divided attention. In her final hours as queen, Camilla carried herself with the same grace that had defined her later years. She dressed simply, spoke little, and refused any gesture that would turn the moment into spectacle. When the brief ceremony concluded and the crown passed to William, she curtsied one last time, a symbolic bow not to the throne, but to the institution she had served alongside her husband. It was, in every sense, a final act of devotion. Witnesses recall the room falling utterly silent as she stepped back, her title officially gone. She smiled faintly, not out of pride, but peace. Then she turned and walked out of the room. No one followed her. She left the palace not as a queen, but as a woman who had done what she came to do. Within hours, her name disappeared from official communications. Her portraits were quietly removed from certain offices, her insignias retired. History would remember her, but only in the footnotes of the transition, dignified, discreet, and done. The public reaction was immediate and deeply divided. Some saw the move as cold, a sharp erasure of a woman who had weathered decades of scrutiny. Others praised it as a graceful exit, one that preserved the integrity of the crown for the next generation. Whatever the opinion, no one could deny the elegance with which Camilla bowed out. There were no interviews, no memoirs, no defenses. Only silence. Her last private appearance came later that evening, in a quiet corner of the palace garden. Those who saw her said she stood by the window for several minutes, looking out into the rain-damp grass, her hands clasped. She wasn't weeping or distraught, just still, reflective, almost serene. When asked later what she might have been thinking in that moment, one staff member said, "She knew this was how it had to end. It wasn't a loss, it was a release." And then she was gone. Camilla departed Buckingham Palace the same way she had arrived 2 decades earlier, quietly, without grand farewell. She returned to her private residence, where she now lives in near seclusion, far removed from the rituals of royal life. Those close to her describe her days as peaceful, filled with reading, gardening, and long walks with her dogs. She keeps no staff beyond a small, trusted circle. The woman once at the center of the crown has chosen invisibility, a freedom few in her position ever get to experience. But perhaps the most telling detail of all is what she left behind. Inside her former office, on the day she departed, palace aides discovered a single handwritten note. It contained no signature, no date, just a simple line written in her familiar script: "Service means knowing when to step aside." Those who found it didn't dare move it. To this day, it reportedly remains there, framed and preserved as a reminder of her parting words to the institution she helped stabilize. For the royal household, her departure marked the true close of one era and the start of another. Without Camilla, the balance of power inside the palace shifted. The new reign would not share the dual leadership that Charles and Camilla embodied. It would be singular, streamlined, focused entirely on the next generation. William and Catherine would take the mantle together, representing a modernized, emotionally attuned monarchy that reflected the world as it is, not as it was. And yet, despite her absence, Camilla's influence lingers quietly. The traditions she revived, the charitable programs she supported, and the poise she modeled in adversity continue to shape the royal image even after her exit. Her legacy may not be celebrated in statues or ceremonies, but in the grace of her withdrawal, a lesson in how to leave with dignity intact. As the world debated her fall from title, she herself seemed unfazed. To her, this wasn't a fall at all. It was, finally, a return to normal life. And in the quiet of her new home, far from the echoing halls of Buckingham Palace, Camilla found something that years of royal duty could never give her: peace without performance. In the hours following the private handover, before the official announcement reached the world, there was one final encounter, a quiet, deeply human moment between King Charles and Camilla that few will ever truly understand. It wasn't the grand farewell of a monarch and consort. It was something simpler, more intimate. The scene, according to those present, was defined not by ceremony, but by stillness. Two people standing at the end of an era they built together, facing what came next with quiet resignation. Before dawn, the palace corridors were hushed. Most of the staff had already been dismissed for the night. Only a small light glowed beneath the door of the king's private study, where Charles and Camilla sat together for what would be their final private conversation as sovereign and queen. The crown, resting nearby on a polished table, gleamed faintly under the lamp. It wasn't between them as a symbol of authority. It was simply there, like an object both of them were ready to let go of. Charles spoke first. His words, one aide said later, were few but heavy. "It's time," he told her again. The same words he'd spoken when they decided to end their joint reign. But this time, it wasn't about the throne. It was about themselves, about stepping into the twilight of their public lives together. Camilla didn't cry, nor did she resist. Instead, she placed her hand over his, a gesture that spoke volumes. "You've done your part," she said softly. "Now let them do theirs." It was a moment of complete understanding. Two people who had faced scrutiny, triumph, and endurance side by side, now acknowledging that their shared chapter as the ruling couple was closed. For all the grandeur of monarchy, it was this moment that revealed its humanity. Gone were the crowns, the audiences, the obligations. What remained were two aging souls who had seen too much of the world's gaze, now finding comfort in the rare privacy of their goodbye. There were no raised voices, no ceremony, just quiet acceptance. Charles reportedly told her that he was proud of her strength, her grace, and the dignity with which she had borne the impossible weight of her role. Camilla's response was characteristically grounded. "It was never easy," she said, but it was worth it. Those who later heard her words said they carried no bitterness, no regret, only peace. It was as though she knew this was the natural conclusion to their reign, one that allowed both of them to walk away without scandal or shadow. As their conversation drew to a close, Charles stood and walked toward the crown resting on the table. He lifted it once, gazed at it for a long moment, then gently placed it back down. Witnesses said the gesture wasn't dramatic, it was reverent, almost tender. For him, the crown had always been more burden than prize. Setting it down felt like releasing a lifetime of expectation. Camilla then rose and adjusted the edge of his sleeve, the way she had done countless times before official appearances. It was a small, familiar gesture, one of affection, of habit, of years spent as partners in both love and duty. And then, she smiled. "You'll be remembered for this," she told him, "for knowing when to stop." When she left the room, she didn't look back. Charles watched her go, his expression unreadable but calm. For a few moments, he remained alone, the crown before him, the silence stretching long and heavy. Then, as if making peace with history itself, he turned off the light and stepped into the corridor, ready to meet the dawn that would no longer belong to him. Later that morning, as the ceremony quietly unfolded, Camilla's composure never faltered. Even as her title was removed and her role ended, she carried herself with poise. Observers noted that when William entered the chamber to receive the crown, Camilla's eyes softened, not with sadness, but with something closer to pride. She knew this was what Charles wanted. She knew, too, that the monarchy needed this reset to survive in a world that had grown weary of spectacle. After the ceremony, while the rest of the palace staff moved with tense efficiency, Camilla slipped away for a private walk through the palace gardens. It was early morning, and the air carried that cool, crisp stillness that comes just after a London rain. Alone among the hedges, she stopped beside the ancient stone fountain and watched the water ripple. This garden had witnessed generations of monarchs, but none had left it quite like this, without fanfare, without tears, without farewell. One attendant, who spotted her from a distance, said it looked as though she was whispering something to herself. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a goodbye. Then, without ceremony, she turned and walked back inside, ready to take her final leave from the only home she had known as Queen. Later that day, Charles joined her for one last shared meal. It was private, informal, just the two of them in a small dining room tucked away from the grandeur of the palace. They spoke, laughed faintly, reminisced. At one point, Camilla reportedly reached across the table, touched his hand, and said, "You gave them everything they needed. Now they'll see what comes next." It was the kind of closure few royal marriages have ever been granted. Quiet, mutual, built on understanding rather than conflict. They didn't need grand speeches or public displays of affection. The bond they shared was one forged in endurance, and it ended the same way, privately, respectfully, and on their own terms. By the time the official announcement was released, both had already retreated from public view. Charles, now carrying the honorary title of Advisor Emeritus, began preparing for a quieter life dedicated to reflection and mentorship. Camilla, now Queen Consort Emerita, had already returned to her private estate. They parted not as monarch and consort, but as companions who had finished their shared duty. For the world, the image of the monarchy was shifting rapidly. But for those inside Buckingham Palace that night, it wasn't the spectacle of transition that stayed with them, it was the sound of that final goodbye, spoken softly in the corridors of history. In many ways, their farewell symbolized a changing royal philosophy. Where past monarchs clung to power until their final breath, this generation had chosen something far braver, letting go. And perhaps that was the true legacy of Charles and Camilla's reign, that they left not with noise, but with grace. When the weight of the crown finally passed to Prince William, it was not with the grandeur of trumpets or the sweep of royal processions. It was a moment of silence, private, deliberate, almost sacred in its simplicity. Those present described it not as a coronation, but as a transfer of spirit. William did not step forward as a man claiming power. He approached as a son accepting a lifelong duty. In that moment, history didn't just shift, it softened. Witnesses said the room itself seemed to hold its breath. The crown, resting on a velvet cushion, reflected the dim light from a nearby chandelier. Charles's voice was steady, though touched with emotion, as he looked upon his son, the man who would now bear the legacy he had carried for decades. William bowed his head, not in submission, but in reverence. When he finally accepted the crown, he did so with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what it represented. He did not rush. He didn't smile. There was no performance, no gesture meant for cameras or audiences. He lifted the crown with quiet focus and, for a brief moment, simply looked at it. To many, that pause said everything, a silent acknowledgement of the sacrifice, history, and humanity bound within the object he was about to wear. And when he finally placed it upon his head, the act felt less like ascension and more like inheritance. This was not the coronation the world was used to. There were no choirs, no public crowds, no global broadcast. It was intimate, almost reverent. The atmosphere was thick with emotion, not spectacle. And when it was over, there were no cheers, no applause. Only the sound of a single clock chiming from the hall, marking, in its steady rhythm, the passing of one age into another. William's demeanor in those early moments told the story of who he intended to be as king. Where some rulers had clung to ceremony, he embraced sincerity. He knelt briefly beside his father, whispering something that no one nearby could hear. Charles smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. The gesture was personal, a quiet exchange between two generations of monarchs. It wasn't about power. It was about purpose. Those who witnessed it described William's first minutes as king as deeply human. He wasn't detached or stoic. He was reflective, even vulnerable. When he finally stood, the crown in place, his first instinct wasn't to look outward, it was to look to his family. Catherine stood nearby, composed and luminous, her gaze filled with quiet reassurance. The look they shared in that instant seemed to say it all. The future would be different. There were no formal declarations that day. The official address would come later. But in that private moment, William's presence alone spoke volumes. He carried himself not as a ruler demanding loyalty, but as a leader seeking understanding. His coronation, if it could even be called that, was marked not by grandeur, but by grace. It was clear from the start that he intended to lead differently. His first action as king was to turn to his father and bow. It was a gesture that broke centuries of royal protocol, a son honoring the monarch who came before him, even after the crown had changed hands. Charles returned the bow, his expression one of quiet pride. For those in the room, it was a powerful sight, a symbolic bridge between generations. Later, when the ceremony had ended and the chamber emptied, William reportedly remained behind. He stood alone for several minutes, the crown still in place, his reflection cast faintly in the glass of a nearby window. Outside, the dawn was beginning to break, streaks of light cutting through the grey London sky. For a man who had grown up under the constant gaze of the world, this solitude was rare and necessary. One aide, who quietly entered the room to retrieve ceremonial items, described the scene. He looked calm, but you could tell he was thinking of everything: the past, the future, the family, the country. It wasn't triumph on his face. It was burden, acceptance, and something else: compassion. That compassion would soon define his reign. Even in those first hours, William's focus wasn't on titles or tradition, but on people. He spoke to staff individually, thanking them for their service to his father. He made sure that no one was left feeling uncertain about their place in the transition. The kindness was genuine, not performative. It set a tone, one that signaled this new chapter of monarchy would be anchored not in hierarchy, but in humanity. Charles, meanwhile, looked on with quiet satisfaction. For all the world might speculate about tension or ambition, the truth was far simpler. This was a passing of duty, not rivalry. He had raised his son for this, to lead not by command, but by conscience. Watching him take the first steps of kingship with such humility was, for Charles, the final reassurance he needed that he'd made the right choice. When William finally removed the crown later that day and set it beside him, he didn't speak for a while. Those present said he seemed to be listening, to the silence, to his thoughts, perhaps even to history itself. Eventually, he said softly, "It feels heavier than I imagined." It wasn't a complaint, just an acknowledgement. One of the attendants replied quietly, That's because it's real now. For William, the meaning of that moment would linger. He had not only inherited a crown, he had inherited expectations, scrutiny, and the collective memory of a nation. But unlike those before him, he wasn't afraid of that. He understood that leadership today wasn't about commanding distance, it was about building connection. And that realization, born in the quiet of his coronation, would define the years to come. Outside the palace walls, the world had yet to learn what had occurred. But inside, a profound calm settled. Those who served the family sensed the difference immediately. It wasn't the electric tension that often follows change, it was relief, warmth, almost renewal. The crown, once a symbol of solitude, suddenly felt shared again. And as William left the chamber, crown in hand, Catherine beside him, the image they created, though unseen by the public, carried an almost cinematic grace. It wasn't the rise of a ruler, but the beginning of a new guardianship. A monarchy no longer defined by distance, but by quiet devotion. When the quiet ceremony concluded and the crown officially passed to William, the focus turned to the woman who had long stood beside him, Catherine. While the world's attention often falls on kings, it was her calm, unwavering presence that defined the emotional tone of this historic moment. She did not wear a crown that day, nor did she need to. Her strength, her stillness, and her profound empathy filled the space around her like light through stained glass. Those inside the palace later said that as William ascended, it was Catherine who anchored the room, the silent pulse of reassurance amid centuries of ritual and change. For years, Catherine had understood that her role was not simply ceremonial. She had been preparing quietly, not for power, but for permanence, the kind of enduring influence that comes not from command, but from connection. When William took the crown, she didn't step forward to share it, she stepped back to balance it. That instinct, to support rather than overshadow, became the emotional foundation of the monarchy's rebirth. Observers noted that throughout the transition, Catherine spoke little, but when she did, it was with a calm certainty that steadied everyone around her. Even the senior courtiers, accustomed to decades of royal formality, found themselves turning to her for quiet guidance. She never raised her voice, one recalled. But when she spoke, everyone listened. It wasn't authority she carried, it was presence. Her composure was not born from detachment, but from empathy. She understood the human side of royal life better than most, the isolation, the expectations, the relentless scrutiny. And she knew that the monarchy's survival in the modern age depended on rediscovering its humanity. That, perhaps more than anything else, is what made her so vital in this new era. While William shouldered the symbolic weight of kingship, Catherine became its heart. After the ceremony, as the palace slowly emptied and the corridors echoed with the footsteps of attendants, Catherine was seen entering the same study where Charles and Camilla had spoken the night before. William was already there, still in his ceremonial attire, seated in silence beside the crown. When she entered, he looked up, visibly tired, the enormity of the day written in his expression. She didn't say a word at first. Instead, she approached, placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and whispered, "You did it." Those 3 words carried layers of meaning, not triumph, but reassurance. They were a reminder that he didn't have to prove himself, that the moment had already fulfilled its purpose. Witnesses said that after a long pause, William smiled faintly, took her hand, and replied, "We did." That moment, quiet, private, unrecorded, was, in many ways, the real coronation. Not the crown on his head, but the partnership it rested upon. For every monarch who has ruled with duty alone, William and Catherine's union brought something different: empathy shared, burdens balanced, decisions grounded in mutual respect. It was less a hierarchy than a harmony, and it would come to define their reign. In the days that followed, Catherine's natural grace became the monarchy's emotional bridge to the public. She didn't hold press conferences or issue sweeping statements. Instead, her gestures spoke louder, small, genuine, human. A handwritten note left for palace staff thanking them for their faith and patience. A quiet visit to see Charles in his private residence, where she reportedly sat with him in the garden, listening more than speaking. A handwritten letter to Camilla, sent privately, expressing gratitude for your example of dignity. None of these acts were publicized, but word of them inevitably reached the press, and when it did, people saw the future of the monarchy in her restraint. Where the institution had long been seen as cold and distant, Catherine brought warmth and accessibility. Yet she never blurred the line between personal and public. Every word, every appearance, every silence seemed intentional, not calculated, but considerate. She understood the unspoken truth of royal life, that emotion must be shown sparingly, or it loses its meaning. So when she did show it, the world noticed. One such moment came a few weeks after the transition, when she appeared for the first time as Queen beside William at a small, private chapel service. There was no grand entrance, no fanfare, just the two of them walking hand in hand. When they reached the altar, Catherine paused, knelt briefly, and closed her eyes. It was a fleeting gesture, but those present described it as profound. She wasn't praying for power, they said, she was praying for strength. Behind the scenes, her influence deepened. She encouraged William to modernize the royal household quietly, to reduce unnecessary formality, to create an environment where staff felt seen and valued. Meetings that were once rigid became open discussions. Titles were respected but less emphasized. The tone shifted from authority to collaboration. One longtime palace aide summarized it simply: she made it feel like a family again. In private, Catherine carried a deep sense of responsibility. She knew that every era of monarchy is defined not just by policy or public image, but by emotion, by how people feel when they look at their leaders. She once confided to a close friend that she wanted people to see the crown not as a wall, but as a mirror. That philosophy guided everything she did. Her composure also provided balance for William, whose new role weighed heavily in the early weeks. When the public demanded statements or appearances, Catherine often reminded him that leadership could also mean stillness, that sometimes silence speaks loudest. It was her steady presence that allowed him to breathe, to find his rhythm as king without losing his humanity in the process. In time, even the most skeptical royal commentators began to admit that her quiet power was reshaping the image of the crown. It was no longer about grandeur or distance. It was about empathy, integrity, and emotional intelligence. She didn't seek to modernize the monarchy through rebellion or reform, but through reflection, by making it feel real again. And as William began to lead, Catherine's calm influence could be felt in everything he said and did. His first private meetings, his tone with advisors, even the way he interacted with his children, it all reflected the woman beside him. Together, they were building something that no coronation could fully symbolize, a partnership grounded not in privilege, but in purpose. That's why, even as the world reacted to the unprecedented transition, the abdication, the title changes, the quiet ceremony, it was Catherine's grace that gave people something to hold on to. She represented continuity in a moment of upheaval, empathy in an era of distance, and humility where history once demanded grandeur. And perhaps that is why, in the end, the monarchy endured. Because amid the crowns and traditions, it remembered something simple: that power, without compassion, cannot last. Catherine reminded everyone of that truth, not through speeches or spectacle, but through silence, kindness, and the kind of grace that doesn't need to be seen to be felt. As the new reign settled in, a calm unlike any the palace had known in decades began to take shape. The transition from Charles to William had not been the chaotic upheaval so many feared. It had been measured, deliberate, and quietly revolutionary. But beneath the polished veneer of order, there remained an unspoken question that rippled through every corridor of power, every editorial column, every private dinner conversation among courtiers. What happens to Queen Camilla now? Her title, once so fiercely defended, had been quietly stripped, not with scandal, but with strategy. She was not exiled, nor humiliated, nor erased from public record. But the nature of her role changed completely. Overnight, she became Her Majesty the Dowager Queen, a ceremonial label that carried neither duty nor authority. It was not punishment, it was containment. Behind palace walls, the decision had been agonized over. Charles, determined to protect his wife's dignity, had personally overseen every clause of the royal transition documents. William, in turn, had insisted that history remember her service, her years beside his father, the grace with which she endured public hostility, the steadiness she brought to an aging king's reign. The compromise they reached was a constitutional rarity. Camilla would retain her status in name, but not in power. Those closest to her said she accepted the decision with quiet composure. In truth, she had seen it coming long before anyone else had. "My time was borrowed from the beginning," she reportedly told her private secretary days before the abdication. "I was never meant to reign forever." It was a statement not of defeat, but of clarity, an acknowledgement that her chapter in the monarchy's long story had always been temporary. And yet, the palace buzzed with whispers of what she might do next. Some believed she would retreat fully into private life at Raymill House, her beloved country residence in Wiltshire. Others claimed she planned to write a memoir, not of scandal, but of survival. A few speculated that she might even leave the United Kingdom altogether, choosing peace over proximity to a crown that had already taken so much from her. In the weeks after the transition, Camilla was rarely seen in public. Paparazzi stationed outside her estate captured glimpses of her walking through the gardens, often alone, sometimes with her dogs, her hair unstyled, her posture relaxed. Gone were the public engagements, the carefully chosen ensembles, the rigid schedules dictated by royal duty. For the first time in decades, she was living as herself. But the quiet didn't mean absence. Behind the scenes, Camilla's influence lingered. She continued to correspond privately with Charles, who visited her often at Raymill House. Though no longer king, he remained deeply attached to her council, particularly as he adjusted to life away from the throne. They were each other's refuge, one aide said. Even stripped of titles, their bond remained unshaken. What few outside the family realized was that Camilla had left behind more than memories. She had left a record. During her years as queen, she had kept a private collection of letters, notes, and reflections, written in her own hand, stored meticulously inside that now infamous vault in Clarence House. They were not diaries, but fragments, glimpses of what it truly meant to live within the machinery of monarchy. When Charles discovered the vault's contents shortly before his abdication, it was said to have moved him deeply. Some of what he read was tender, her love, her fears, her unwavering loyalty. But some of it, reportedly, was brutally honest. She had written of her doubts, her mistakes, her guilt over the pain caused by their early years together. One passage, according to a royal aide who later saw it, read simply, "History will not forgive us, but perhaps it will understand us." It was those writings that changed Charles's heart in his final weeks as monarch. They reminded him of the fragility of legacy, that a title, however grand, is only temporary. It was after reading them that he decided to accelerate the transition, to pass the throne to William while he still could, while the institution still had a chance to evolve. For Camilla, that decision was both an ending and a mercy. She had watched the monarchy chew through generations of its own, leaving behind hollow lives and broken spirits. To step away before that fate reached her was, in some ways, her final act of strength. Months after the coronation, she made one last public appearance. It was not at Westminster or Buckingham, but at a small animal rescue centre in Devon, one she had supported privately for years. There were no royal photographers, no official statements. Just Camilla, dressed in a simple coat, greeting volunteers, smiling faintly. When one of them thanked her for visiting, she reportedly replied, "It's nice to just be again." That phrase, "to just be," came to define her legacy in the eyes of those who truly understood her. She had entered history as the woman who changed the monarchy from within, not through force, but through endurance. She had weathered storms that would have destroyed anyone else, and when the time came, she stepped back with dignity intact. Her story did not end in disgrace, as so many had predicted, but in quiet restoration. She was no longer a queen in the constitutional sense, but she was, in a deeper way, something rarer, a woman finally at peace with herself. And in that peace, the monarchy found a lesson it desperately needed. Power can be inherited. Titles can be given. But grace, the kind that endures beyond scandal, beyond ceremony, beyond history, can only be earned. In the years to come, when historians would write of this extraordinary royal transition, they would describe it not as the fall of one queen or the rise of another, but as the rare moment when the crown itself remembered what it means to be human. Because in the end, it wasn't the abdication, the coronation, or the vault that defined the story. It was the people behind it, flawed, fragile, and, at last, free.